Today I'm going to be going over the basic principles of how to forge a very simple form of collar. A collar is a metal strap that wraps around two or more bars of steel and just holds them together. They're used to hold decorative elements together in a grill or a railing. It's a pretty simple and effective way of holding things together when you don't need the strength of a riveted or a welded joint. And as you can see, they really do apply a fair amount of clamping pressure. The collar is going to be made out of a 3.5-inch piece of 1/4 by 3/4 flat bar. And the mandrel that I'm using is made out of 1/2-inch square bar, and I folded it back onto itself to represent two bars sitting next to each other. So the mandrel is 1/2 inch by 1 inch. Okay, bear with me now through the theory, because this is something that really puzzled me when I was starting out, and it took me a long time to realize what was going on. This picture shows the accepted means of figuring out the length of a bar. The horizontal dotted line is the center line of the bar, and it's normally the part of the bar that does not change, so you use that to figure out the length. When you bend a bar, the outside of the bend is stretched and the inside of the bend is compressed. And as it turns out, the amount of effort needed to stretch the bar is about equal to what it needs to compress the bar. So the bar gets bent and the center line stays basically unaltered. And it works great except for collars. If you use this method of figuring out the length of the bar for the example that I'm working with today, you would turn out a bar that is 4 inches long, a full 1/2 inch longer than you need. The difference is when you're forging a collar, you're going to be using a bending jig or a mandrel or something that's going to be restricting the movement of the inside corner of that bend. As a result, the stress created by the inside corner of the bend is no longer equal to the outside corner of the bend. That results in the outside corner of the bend stretching a lot more than the inside corner is compressing. And that means that the unaltered area of the bar is no longer in the center, it's being shifted over towards the inside corner of the bar. And I have that represented here by the dotted line. So with the testing that I've done, I've figured out that the line that you need to use to figure out the length of a collar is sitting about 1/4 of the thickness of the bar, and not in the center as it would be if you were just making a freehand bend without a bending jig, or in the vice jaws. But the process of figuring out the actual length of the line is exactly the same, only you're going to be using an imaginary line that's sitting 1/4 of the distance inside the thickness of the collar material. In this example, I just used a square to make the math a little easier. Of course, if you had a rectangular block that you're working with, you would need to substitute the right measurements for each of the sides. I'm going to be forging this collar freehand today without using any kind of bending jigs or anything other than the mandrel that gives it the final shape. Of course, if you need to forge a number of these, you'll be setting up whatever jigs and fixtures you need to make the process easier, and I'll be covering that in other videos. But for today, this is a process that I use for short runs of collars, and it works just fine. So for this method, the only thing you need to mock up is the mandrel, which exactly matches the bars you're tying together. And as you can see in the first heat, I just made a crude shape of a horseshoe that just wraps around the mandrel enough to hold it in place. This is a two-part process. The first step is to forge the collar around the mandrel. So in this instance, the mandrel is actually a forming die that I'm using to shape the collar. The second part of the process is to install the finished collar on the actual bars that are going to be in the grill or the railing that you're working on. In this example, I don't have a grill or a railing that I'm working on, so I'm going to be reinstalling this collar on the mandrel, so I just wanted to clear that up before it caused any confusion. In the last couple of heats, I've just been trying to get the collar wrapped around the mandrel very gradually. I haven't really started setting in any of the corners that are going to lock the position of that collar on the mandrel. The punch that I have sitting on the anvil is just a square-faced punch, and it's narrow enough to fit inside the opening of the collar. I'm going to be using that punch to drive the mandrel down to the anvil, and that's going to flatten out the bottom side of the collar. Once the back is straight, I'm going to start working on the sides to wrap the collar around to the front of the mandrel. I also made this mandrel so it's tapered ever so slightly at the tip, so it's a little bit smaller there than in the main body of the mandrel. So once I get a good fit and a tight corners at the tip of the mandrel, I'll take another heat, slide the collar up to the main body of the mandrel, and do the final fitting there. So this completes part one of the process. Now that the shaping is finished, we need to take another heat and then open up the collar slightly by prying the sides apart very, very carefully. You just need to open it enough to get the bars of the railing inside the collar, and you want to try to bend the flat portion of the collar, not the corners. So in this part of the process, the mandrel is representing the two bars in the railing that you want to set the collar around. You can see how I didn't quite get the collar opened up enough. You should be able to slip the collar on without moving the railing at all. Once the collar's in place, you set it on the anvil and you use the square punch once again to drive the back side of the collar down to the anvil. And with a really heavy pair of tongs, you close the gap in the collar. And then you just hammer the surface lightly to make sure that the edges are driven flush to the surface. Remember, this collar is in the center of a railing, so you're not going to be able to spin it around to hammer the different sides of the collar to get it set. You're going to have to rely on the mandrel being the right size for the collar, so when you squeeze it back shut, everything's right. Hi, I'm Dennis, and thanks for watching. As most of you know, for the past few years I've been producing YouTube videos on a part-time basis. I am now looking to turn that hobby into a full-time job, and for that I really need your help. A small monthly contribution from a really small number of viewers will generate the income that I need to achieve that goal. So if you're interested in the work that I'm doing and you want to lend your support, please click on the Patreon icon at the bottom of the screen. Thank you. We'll see you next time.